Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Hudson Library for our virtual author program with award-winning author and art historian Bridget Quinn. She's joining us this evening for a conversation about her new book, Portrait of a Woman, Art, Rivalry, and Revolution in the Life of Adélaïde Labille-Guiard. Bridget Quinn is a writer, art historian, and critic. She's the author of the award-winning book, Broad Strokes, 15 Women Who Made Art and Made History in that Order. And she votes how U.S. women won suffrage and what happened next. A graduate of New York University's Institute of Fine Arts and a regular contributor to the arts magazine Hyperallergic, Quinn is a sought-after speaker on women and art. And we have copies of Portrait of a Woman available for purchase courtesy of the Learned Owl Bookshop. As I mentioned, there is a link in the chat if you'd like to purchase your copy tonight. Well, Bridget, thank you so much for your time this evening. We're looking forward to, of course, hearing more about your new book, but also the work that you've been doing on bringing female artists to the forefront of our attention. So delighted to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to everyone who turned out on what I hear is a beautiful evening there. And just thank you to the library for creating a space like this where we can, come together in community and talk about books and in this case about art. I think it's worth saying that community is a big part of the story of the French painter that I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'm going to share my screen now. Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, a slightly complicated name for English speakers. For that reason, I'm going to slightly Americanize her name and use just her first name just to keep things running smoothly. Writing a book for an English-speaking audience about characters or figures who all had three complicated names at its challenges, and speaking about them even more so. So for the most part, I'm going to be using first names. The book itself really is about community. It's about a neighborhood of artists living near the Louvre in Paris in the 18th century who encouraged and helped to educate a young woman who came from a non-artist family. That is Adélaïde Labille-Guiard. And this is a portrait of one of her neighbors by her, Augustin Pajou. He's a sculptor who lived in the Louvre. The Louvre at that time actually was a residence for artists. So there in the Louvre and in the surrounding neighborhood were fine artists. And so even though she didn't grow up in an artistic family, she had the opportunity to be surrounded by practitioners of art. And what kind of makes her story so remarkable in the history of Western art is that as a woman from a non-artistic family, she was able to find education and encouragement. And maybe even more remarkably and more encouragingly, I think, for us today is that Adélaïde in turn helped to encourage and educate another generation of women artists. This is her monumental oil painting, Self-Portrait with Two Pupils. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if you ever have the chance to see it. Adélaïde really risked her life during the revolution, during the French Revolution, to support a new generation of women artists and to allow them to have the kind of opportunities that she was able to find. So her story is really one of friendship and faith and belief in the necessity of art for everyone. And so I'm going to read just a little bit from the book, and I'll try to keep it lively. I hope it will be. And mostly, I hope you can enjoy her beautiful work, which will be on the screen. So maybe you know the term chiaroscuro. You might remember it from a dusty art history course that you took once, or some half-forgotten book. It's definitely a wonderful word to say. Difficult though, chiaroscuro. It means light and dark. And Western painting owes its poetry, its kind of drama to this play of light and shadow that is chiaroscuro. Both visually and metaphorically, light and dark is really how we comprehend the world. Without the devil, there's no God, no hero without their antagonist, and no heroine either. Literature knows this, and art history does too. And so I chose, in writing the book, to tell the story of this too little known painter, Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, alongside the words of a far more famous artist who has long been cast as her rival. And this is a self portrait by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun from around 1782. Elizabeth wrote a celebrated memoir in letters called The Souvenir, which I regularly quote from in the book. It's 3 volumes, and she started publishing it at the age of 80. It was hugely successful. And in The Souvenir, she celebrates the many virtues of her ardent person, of her friend, Queen Marie Antoinette, of Paris in the age before revolution, and of her marvelous royal acquaintances across Europe. Of Adelaide, a fellow artist whose name was once routinely linked with hers, Elizabeth says absolutely nothing in those 3 volumes beyond one single nameless reference, a kind of calculated oversight as the ultimate shade, and omission as fuel for the ash heap of history. Of course, history's ash heap is a metaphorical one, but there were real ashes too. Adelaide's most ambitious canvas was this monumental multi-figure painting, and it was burned in a Paris public square on a warm summer night in 1793. It was a bonfire of art that was literally cheered on by crowds. Uh, Adelaide never recovered from her losses that night, and neither did her reputation. By the time she died just 10 years later, her status as a celebrated French artist was already endangered. For one thing, she'd acquired a new married name. This is her portrait of her very late in life husband, Francois André Vincent. It looks like Vincent when you see it on the page. Um, and it was a name that was entirely unconnected to the names that she'd used as a painter in Paris before and during the French Revolution. And while the revolution sought social advancements in many arenas, it really enacted reforms that restrict women's rights. And all of this led to a kind of erasure and forgetting about this incredible career of, of a woman artist during the French Revolution. This is the portrait of Madame Genlis from 1780 by Adelaide. It's in the LA County Museum of Art, and I just love this painting because of her green gloves. When I was a young woman studying art history, recovering the thread of Adelaide's life and work in this erasure was this private act of inspiration for me. When I encountered her work at the age of 22, it really changed the course of my life. And now that I'm a middle-aged woman with women's rights really under siege in this country and around the world, remembering Adelaide today feels essential. Her life is in many ways an object lesson in how women's rights have been suddenly reversed before and how often women's achievements are forgotten. And she really offers this counter narrative to a notion of women at war with each other, battling for sole position as the one woman of any era. Her manufactured rivalry with Elizabeth was really the hot take of its time, and definitely that titillating aura persists. But what I love about Adelaide is that she celebrated the achievements of other women along with her own, and that solidarity and self belief really offers its own inspiration. I first encountered her work in the fall of 1990, the summer before, at age 21. I had moved to New York City, where I had always wanted to live. As a kid on the Montana plains, this is a picture right outside my house. My house was just over the hill behind that Ayrshire Dairy billboard. When I was growing up in this rural town, I'd looked to stories like Harriet the Spy and From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Frankweiler to find myself, which was a kind of nerdy girl who was in pursuit of freedom and high culture. And I found myself going from my town in Montana to the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, which is just down the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. the very place where Claudia Kincaid had hidden out with her little brother in the books that I read, uncovering art historical secrets within the Met's vast unfurling halls. And I arrived at the Institute intending to receive a PhD. The Institute is what we all called it. It was a place as vaunted and cult-like as that sounds. I think you can see from, this was our lecture hall. It had a certain level of intimidation for a young woman who'd grown up the way I had. And so I was really still learning how to assert intellectual equality with the students that I shared seats with when I found myself my second semester in a seminar on 18th century French art. And on the first day of class, we all picked topics for our research projects. And within minutes, all of my classmates had scooped up everyone in 18th century art I'd ever heard of, and I didn't know what to do. I just sat there not knowing when my professor put a slide into the projector. For anyone young enough, that's how we used to look at images. And he put up this painting and he said, it's by a woman artist who somehow lived through the French Revolution, and this terrific self-portrait ended up across the street. And he gestured toward Fifth Avenue, and I raised my hand. For the next 5 years, I made near daily visits to this painting, a ritual that really became as instinctual to me as brushing my teeth. And after so long, 3 decades, more than 3 decades, I can't remember, of course, when I first saw her up close, but I do know what we wore. Adélaïde, sky blue gown, folds shimmering with reflected light, white lace framing a stunning display of décolletage, big white bow between her breasts like a happy present. Frothy, fabulous, and oddly fierce. Me, black cropped Levi's, a motorcycle jacket, sullen and agitated. I couldn't find a picture of me in the motorcycle jacket, but I thought this was funny because I'm wearing a t-shirt with Edvard Munch's The Scream on it, which is just funny on brand. It's hard to remember now what had me wound so tight, but visiting Adélaïde helped. And from the first, like any hardcore fan, I couldn't get enough of her. I stalked every sketch, pastel, painting, and possible attribution. I had this mad sense of duty because she was an artist who had promoted other women, and I wanted to do the same for her. I wrote my qualifying paper on her in pursuit of the PhD that I have not yet obtained, and I devoted a chapter to her in my first book. But there was so much more that needed saying. I knew it, and I felt that she knew it too. This is her portrait of Princess Adélaïde from 1787. It's gigantic, by the way. As I grew older over the decades, I felt like I sensed her disappointment in me, like a ghost in the room or in my heart. I am 56 now, 2 years older than Adélaïde was when she died. And over the decades since we first met, I have been visited by her in ways big and small. She enters my dreams and my waking thoughts, and she's demanded my presence on multiple occasions. On her behalf, I have spent a fortune in out-of-print books, some of which are here, just to see if she's mentioned. I've followed her across the country, out of the country, on quests from which I often had neither time nor money, but I needed to view a painting, to see an exhibition, and get a glimpse of Adélaïde once more. Like a pilgrim tracking down the arm bone of a saint, I wanted to commune with her. Several times I started to write her story, born in 1749 and all the rest. I began in the official, biographical, or art historical ways, but I just felt like it never worked. I tried memoir, essays, fiction, and I gave up, restarted again. But as they say, resistance is futile. And that's how I find myself quoting Star Trek in a story about 18th century French art. I relinquished control and gave it over in some ways to Adélaïde. Unlike Elizabeth, Adélaïde didn't write the story of her life. She never wrote her memoirs or much of anything. She left no diary. Instead, what we have from her own hand are her paintings, pastels, and drawings, which themselves have a lot to reveal. And so I approached her story once again, but this time I waited as much as I researched. I went quiet, looking and listening for the centuries long dead who reached across the veil of time and space and pointed, whispered, led. They had stories to tell me, tales of lives hinted at in art and other places. and there can't really be scholarly footnotes for the conjuring of informed imagination. But in Adelaide's case, without imagination, there's only silence, which I could no longer abide. So here I began, Adelaide's voice, more than 2 centuries, excuse me, after her death. And I include this painting from the Nelson Atkins Museum because it's of the man who was her eulogist, who was the Minister of Arts. Today, whenever Adelaide is mentioned, it's almost always in counterpoint to her better known so-called rival, Elizabeth. When it comes to women artists or women creatives, women of talent, the world loves a catfight. It was true then, and it's still true now. You can see Beyonce and Taylor. In late 18th century France, there was no one who understood this desire for competition among women better than um, an impresario who I'm going to call for convenience sake La Blancherie. He had about 16 names. He was a Paris P.T. Barnum, a producer, promoter, salesman, and huckster. He was a little bit brilliant and quite a bit déclassé and a hell of a lot of fun. And La Blancherie is the one who really ignited one of the great rivalries in art. In 1777, he debuted an exhibition that he would call the Salon de la Correspondance. And it was this weekly kind of hodgepodge display of anything fabulous that caught his fancy. It could be locksmithing or metallurgy or painting, sculpture, drawings, anything. And all of it he would then write up in this effusive publication he called What's New in the Republic of Arts and Letters. And What's New reported on all that had been marveled at or overheard at his salon. And La Blancherie soon saw that the official Académie Royale, the Royal Academy's strict limits on membership, had left many important, significant French artists out in the cold, and especially women artists. During the 8-year existence of his salon, he welcomed many artists who had not been allowed into the Academy, including at least 19 women. And for 2 of them, that publicity would prove decisive even to how we understand them today. And that's, of course, Adelaide and Elizabeth. Among the wonders that La Blancherie displayed in the spring of 1782, when he also showed this pastel by Adélaïde Labille-Guiard called Delightful Surprise. Like I said, he would show all kinds of things. It was kind of a cabinet of curiosities. He showed a 2-headed calf, and also, as he described, a hen having laterally to the right and left 2 ovarian openings with entirely separate wombs. For most monsters of this species, one of the 2 embryos is incomplete, but in this one, they are both perfect. So in my mind, he has a thing for doubling: a 2-headed calf, poultry sporting 2 wombs, and 2 impressive women painters who are not necessarily monsters, but not necessarily entirely natural either. So at the same time, that same spring, Adelaide shows with a charming portrait pair, only one of which we know the location of, or that we still have, and that's this Delightful Surprise, which is owned by the Getty in California. And there was a portrait that went with it of a young man that we don't have anymore. But instead of choosing to promote Adelaide's kind of naughty couple, he instead promotes a pairing of 2 women, Adelaide and Elizabeth, in self-portraits that they had at the salon. These are both from 1792. On the left is Adelaide's self-portrait, a pastel that we don't know the location of anymore and only have in this black and white photograph. It's not a very crisp photograph, so apologies. And on the right, by Elizabeth, her self-portrait in a straw hat. So wonder of wonders, freaks of nature, 2 women artists, impossible aberrations of nature that could somehow inexplicably still create beautiful forms held up for viewers to compare and contrast. And they have a lot in common, obviously. It's both 2 women with unpowdered hair, They have these big feathered hats. They're both wearing dangling earrings, and they both hold in their left hands paintbrushes and palettes. But they also have a lot that can be contrasted. Um, Adelaide's is pastel, Elizabeth's is oil. One is sitting, one is standing. It's a studio scene versus the outdoors. One covers her chest rather decorously, while the other has a plunging neckline, let's say. And most interesting to me, I think, is Adelaide has this sort of tight, close-lipped smile, and Elizabeth's lips are slightly parted, and you can see her teeth. And with this pairing and what he wrote about it, La Blancherie really kicked off a rivalry between two women who really had nothing to be rivals about, except that they both existed in a world that was not intended for them. But as he enthused in his publication, the self-portraits of two women artists, which chance has brought together, have created a highly piquant spectacle, which chance has brought together. Well, La Blancherie himself, of course, hung the show. Et voila, among dozens of offerings, these two self-portraits hang together. And not just their canvases, but the two of them as women are now publicly compared. And that's the piquant part, which when I looked it up in my French to English dictionary was spicy or engagingly provocative. And from this moment forward, critics tended to compare them, the two artists, to each other rather than to any of their male colleagues. So the rivalry begins. And it's kind of impossible for us to know exactly what the public assessed since we don't have Adelaide's self-portrait to look at directly. But we do know that, it's a pastel being held up against an oil that is still celebrated for its beauty and brio. One version of Elizabeth's self-portrait with straw hat hangs today in London's National Gallery. And also in the National Gallery is the painting which she used as her inspiration for her own, and that's Peter Paul Rubens' portrait of Susanna London from 1622. And this work is often called the straw hat, or was often called that, even though she doesn't wear a straw hat. It's kind of inexplicable. And while Elizabeth hewed literally to that title, she's wearing a straw hat, she also really understood that the thing in Rubens' portrait that's essential to its appeal isn't the hat, but the play of sunlight and gentle shadow across the face of a pretty young woman. Elizabeth was clearly inspired by Rubens' use of light and color, but she diverges from him in her depiction of temperament. Hers is really how a woman sees herself. So while Rubens, his Susanna glances shyly out from under her hat with just the barest hint of a smile, almost kind of embarrassed to be seen, Elizabeth looks directly out at us, charismatic and confident, cherry lips glossy and parted so that we can glimpse her teeth. And it's really the artist as a kind of starlet, self-consciously so. How can Adelaide possibly compete? Well, here she really can't. In this self-portrait, she's a little stiff, almost like a middle school student on picture day. I kind of think of Elizabeth as the class beauty, sure of her social standing, while Adelaide is sort of the nerdy hopeful, wearing what she hopes are the right clothes. And she's not sure if she's pulling it off, but she knows in advance that she's being judged. Not just her art, but her whole self, including her appearance, and her looks were often publicly found wanting, particularly in comparison to Elizabeth, who was widely celebrated as one of the beauties of Paris. Adelaide's self-portrait is less an advertisement of herself and more an advertisement of her ability. She depicts these perfect feathers, this transparent fichu around her shoulders, glinting earrings, and shiny silken reflet. It's not really about her, but about what she can make her brushes do. So the duel is now engaged in earnest. It's one created for public consumption, probably more than stemming from any personal animosity. I mean, we don't know how Adélaïde and Elizabeth really felt about each other. We don't have any accounts from either of them, but I mean, it couldn't have been easy when one mostly only received positive public commentary at the expense of the other. I think, I mean, would you like someone that you're obviously being compared to all the time in public? I don't know. It reminds me again of high school, the competition, the cliques. I mean, it's understandable if they didn't love each other. Um, but it wasn't personal, I don't think, or there's no evidence that that it was. And so the rivalry is a manufactured one, but the stakes are real. Elizabeth by now is already the favorite painter of Marie Antoinette, and she unflinchingly allies herself with the old masters. But Adélaïde parries with a series of pastel portraits intended to claim her place among the current masters of French art. And this is a portrait of Francois-André Vincent from 1783, Vincent, her late life husband. And between 1782 and 1783, she showed 6 portraits at the Salon de la Correspondance, all members of the French Royal Academy, including her childhood friend, and who by this time was her current teacher, here Vincent, as well as his own teacher, Joseph Marie Vien. And it was really a brilliant move because by creating portraits of important members of the Académie Royale, Adélaïde was really securing eyewitnesses to her talent. They saw her do these portraits. And if you admired your portrait, you had to admire her ability as well. And it's also a way of publicly saying, I belong among these men. I, both by ability and by artistic legacy. So by depicting her teacher here, Vincent, and her teacher's teacher, Vien, she claims her own place in this lineage of French art. In his public journal, La Blancherie loudly proclaimed the confidence in her talents demonstrated by these distinguished men. And then he added that such work completely destroys the false opinion that envy or ignorance has hastened to spread, that the merit of her works was owed to a foreign hand. So that sly La Blancherie, out of one side of his mouth, he praises Adélaïde, while out of the other, he drops the slander that a man, in this case, almost certainly Vincent, is responsible for her work. It's a little bit like his chicken laying eggs from 2 holes or a 2-headed calf. He gets 2 for 1. Adélaïde was hardly the only woman to experience such accusations. Elizabeth faced them too at this time and later, and so have many women artists throughout history, and sometimes they still do. And that is the end of my short introduction to the life and art of Adélaïde Labille-Guiard and her rivalry with Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun.
If you have questions for the author, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen if you want to join the conversation tonight. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm glad you had so many pictures included in it, because I think as for an art biography and an artist, if the books don't have pictures, I feel like I'm always looking it up as I'm reading. Like, I want to see what you're talking about in your paintings or in your book. And it is just remarkable, I think, when you look at her pictures. Now, I've never seen them in person. You said you got to see them every day for 5 years, so you probably know every little
Well,
detail
this one
of
I
them.
did.
Yeah. But just from looking at it in a book or in your book or on the computer, like, I don't think you can really appreciate how gifted she was and talented she was as an artist. I mean, just the amount of detail in her silk dress is breathtaking.
Exactly. I mean, the dress is overwhelming, and I have it in the book, but when you see it in person, you really notice that she has this shine on the floor. Can you see my cursor when I roll it over?
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's this shine on the floor where you can see the reflection of the blue of her dress in the gloss of the floor.
Wow.
I mean, the details are incredible, and
Yeah.
the way light plays along the silk folds of her dress. I mean, it's truly masterful.
What I thought was interesting in your book, you talked about, well, of course, the rivalry between the two, but Elizabeth had so many more advantages as an artist than Adelaide. Her father was an artist. She married an
Right.
art dealer. She had a lot of
She was
things.
beautiful. I mean,
Yeah,
that's never hurt a woman.
right. And then Adelaide, she didn't come from a family of artists or anything like that, but rightfully so, she was just as good, if not better, than Elizabeth, even without the
I mean,
advantages she had.
they're both incredibly gifted
Hmm.
and ambitious and artists of the highest quality. There's no question. Um, but over and over again, including now, we kind of only want there to be one woman, one winner, one
Hmm.
best. And there wasn't just these two women, there were other women artists, even in France, even in Paris, who were exceptional. I mentioned to you that the Toledo Museum of Art has a painting by Anne Vallier-Castet, who was also a woman artist at this time, that is fantastic. And she was also part of the Royal Academy. Yeah, there's more than one great woman artist at any given time, even given how difficult it was to become a professional artist.
Hmm. That was actually one of my favorite chapters in your book was your chapter on that you called Self-Portrait with Two Pupils, where you kind of disseminated this painting. I mean, that painting is very large. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, it's heroic size, so slightly over life size.
It feels like there's so much in it. I don't know where to look first, but I loved in that chapter how you kind of disseminated the painting and kind of brought to attention different things about like her slippers and the floor and the statues in the background. Like these are all things that you don't necessarily see right offhand. Um, but it's amazing looking at all of the details in her pictures. We have a couple questions from the audience. Let's take a look here. Um, can you share more? Catherine asked, can you share more bio? Is there a book of her paintings? What painting was thrown in the fire?
I'm not sure I understand the first part of the question. Is there a book that's just of all of her paintings, you mean? Is that like a catalogue raisonné?
Maybe, perhaps. Do we know how many paintings?
Um,
Because she did pastels and portraits. Do we know like how many pieces of art that she?
y- yes. So, okay, so hold the question for me so that I can remember it. So the first part
Yeah.
is how many paintings does she have? So she has less than 200 that we know of,
Okay.
which is not very many. Also, in the 18th century, pastels are also considered paintings. So even though, I mean, I think we think of pastel maybe as a kind of lesser media and maybe a preparatory media. But in the 18th century, it was really its own genre. And they could be quite large. They were done on multiple sheets of paper to make them quite big. So her pastels are incredible. They're incredible. And they are as monumental in their way as any oil painting. They're not as big as her oil paintings, which are gigantic. So less than 200 that we know of, but it's very common for the work of women artists to be flipped into the oeuvre of male artists. So, for example, because of course, um, work by famous male artists is worth a lot more money and has a lot more status than a work by a lesser known woman artist. So, for example, when I was a graduate student, there was a portrait at Harvard's Fogg Art Museum that was believed to be by Jacques-Louis David, who is kind of the towering figure of 18th century French art, or at least second half of the century, and was later reattributed to Adélaïde Labille-Guiard. So it might be that there are more Labille-Guiards than we know that are out there, but it's also true that after her painting was burned in the revolution, and I'll say something about that, that was the other part of the question. Um, she fell into some kind of illness. We don't know what it was. Her eulogist sort of makes the claim that her broken heart over losing the painting that was burned is what caused her illness that eventually killed her. But she has very little production after that. So where Elizabeth is traveling Elizabeth flees the French Revolution, travels across Europe doing portraits of nobility. And so she's churning out work while Adelaide's living through, the terror of the French Revolution and doing much less work. So definitely there's not a lot by her, but there might be more than we know. The painting that was burned was what's called a history painting. So women were not allowed to be history painters, and history paintings were the highest level of French academic painting. A history painting is large, like very large, and has some kind of narrative quality. So it might be a biblical scene or a scene from classical history or a battle. There's going to be like horses and weapons and nudes. So what's required to do a history painting is a perfect understanding of anatomy. And how do you learn anatomy? You have to study from the nude. And women are not supposed to study from the nude. So in effect, women cannot be history painters. But this painting, when it was shown at the Royal Salon in 1785, was such a success that Adelaide became a painter to the aunts of the king. So they were called the Mesdames. And the king was King Louis XVI, the king who eventually is guillotined during the French Revolution. And she does 3 monumental portraits of the sister of these aunts. And those portraits are in Versailles. Anyone can go see them now. They're on permanent display. And they're fantastic. And the king's brother, the Comte de Provence, this is also complicated. It flows in the book, believe me. But the king's brother is so favorably inclined by these portraits that he commissions a history painting from Adelaide. This is, it's impossible to overstate how important this is for her career, but also for her legacy, for her position. So she will, with this one painting, be able to enter the highest echelon of French art. And she spends 8 years working on it and plows a ton of her own money into it. So it's kind of like, imagine if I wrote my book, I spent, 10 years researching it, 30 years hoping to write it, spent all this time researching it, putting money into it, and then I was told I finished it or became close to finishing it, and then I was told I had to burn it. That's how it was for her, maybe worse. So it's this defining moment, and yeah, it's crippling for her, crushing.
Let me see here. Cameron asked, does your favorite painting of hers change over time with your evolving knowledge and age and wisdom? If so, why?
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah, I mean, I first encountered this painting when I was 22 years old, and I was absolutely riveted by it. I could not, and I couldn't explain why, and I couldn't really look away. And I think now, looking back, that there was something about these 2 young women who are with her, that she's kind of their mentor and their guide into the world of becoming an artist that captivated me. And I wanted her to do the same for me. I ended up leaving my PhD program to become a writer. Uh, I would say partly, but also, but more than partly, inspired by Adelaide's example and under kind of the sway of this painting. So this was without question. I mean, I had a postcard of this, on my desk for decades. But as I get older, well, first of all, that portrait of Madame Genlis that I showed, I don't know, I might not be able to find it now that I'm middle aged. Oh, this is funny. When I went to Versailles and saw the pastel studies for this portrait, with the portrait of the Princess Adelaide, no relation, I realized I was 52 when I was in Versailles looking at the pastels that the curators had brought out for me to look at. And so I was right up close to seeing kind of like the wrinkles on her face and just you look aged. And I realized as I was peering down into this pastel that I was the exact same age as Princess Adelaide in that pastel. And it just, yeah, it was like a weird time warp that I had gone from this 22-year-old girl, really, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art to being in the archives of Versailles, looking at someone exactly my age. But the painting that I love the most now is here's Madame Genlis. I love this painting at the LA County Museum of Art. There's just something so like, I know myself, and also how can you not love this gigantic bow in her hair and the green gloves? But the cover of the book um, with a woman writing is my favorite painting of hers now. It just, and how she's just looking so directly at us. We don't know the name of the sitter of this painting. It's called Portrait of a Woman. That's the name of the painting as well, because uh, her identity is unknown, and there's something very tempting about sort of inserting your own interpretation into it that is really kind of thrilling to me. I love it.
So I know you said that there weren't any memoirs or diaries or letters of her. How, just curious, like what a challenge that was for your research for this book or any of the books that you've written on her, um, even your other book, Broad Strokes, like how challenging was it to put research together when you didn't have those primary resources to reference?
I mean, the research, so much research has been done by excellent scholars, so that I already had what there was.
Mm.
So in some ways, it's very limited. It's not, one of the difficulties on writing a biography of, say, a 20th century person, or imagine 21st century when there's email like that you could maybe access, is just the overwhelm of material. Broad strokes, in some ways, as I go along in that book, it gets more and more difficult to kind of figure out what you're going to talk about, because everything. Every grape that they ate, every person they met on the on the corner. You can, depending on the person. So in some ways it limited the scope. That said, there's a lot around her. I mean, it's France. It's a highly literary society, and one highly into letter writing, for one thing. So there are letters going back and forth that are official, where she is requesting lodgings in the Louvre as an artist, for example, or writing to ask that someone be sued for libel for the horrible things that are said by her about her in public. So we have those kinds of things, but the really intimate things that you would hope to have, there's nothing.
Yeah.
So I felt like I really had to look at her work, what she was putting in it. I also just want to make a plea that if we have the expectation that the only way we can write about people of the past is if we have all of these primary sources, then the same people will always be written about. And that's basically literate men who whose written accounts were valued enough to keep. Um, and the stories, the tales, the voices of other people that matter, we have to find another way to tell those stories. And so I did the best I could. And sometimes I had to use my imagination, but I used it in a way that I hope was as informed as it could possibly be. And I tried to not just, you know, make anything up. I mean, of course, anytime there's dialogue, you're making it up. But knowing they were in this place, that this is what happened, this is what went down. Yeah, it's very tricky.
Lori asked, and I think she's talking about the two portraits. She would like to see the side-by-side paintings again. I think it was the two portraits of the
Oh
women.
yeah,
And she
sure.
asked, also asked if you know where the one on the right is located. I think it was the one of Elizabeth.
Yes, yes, that
There it is.
this painting of Elizabeth is at the National Portrait Gallery in London, and we don't know where this pastel is, or it's in a private collection that we're not able to contact.
Sarah asked, well, we don't know Adelaide had students. She asked did Adelaide have any students? And if so, were they only women? What was the societal view of at the time of men studying with a female teacher, if that happened?
That did not happen. Men did not study with a female teacher, at least not in any kind of official setting. I can imagine that maybe a mother or an aunt, or in some, that had some, because women often were given the skills of art kind of as um, a womanly feather in your cap, however you'd say it. They learn to sing or play music, to draw. Rousseau recommends that young girls be taught to draw, but he says, it's good for them to develop this womanly skill, but not so much that they want to be artists. You can let them maybe decorate flowers or learn how to draw flowers so they can decorate their clothing, things like that. So women sometimes have the skills developed for a certain level of art. So I can imagine them teaching, children in some way, but not in a professional sense. There were men who taught women. It was not easy, and it was discouraged, and sometimes got them in a lot of trouble. In Adelaide's case, she took on students because she seemed to have really enjoyed teaching young women. Also, she really needed money. So she was married around age 19 or 20. And it was a very unsuccessful marriage. She was able to get a legal separation after about 8 years, and lived as an independent woman for another 20 years. So, it's not easy to make a living as in any era as an artist, but especially as an independent woman artist. So she needed students for partly for her livelihood, but she was a celebrated teacher. Her students were widely exhibited, and often the press would say, like, "Oh, Madame Adelaide's students are the best students that there are, in this show, or the best young artists in this show." So she was known as being both a teacher of young women and as someone who liked teaching young women.
You kind of answered the next question in what you just said. Laurel asked, can you tell about her personal life? Wikipedia seems to say that she was divorced and married her second husband in about the same year.
No, that's completely not right. So she, well, first of all, divorce isn't legal in France. So she gets married in 1800, or is I'm sorry, she gets married in 1769 to her first husband. They're married about 8 years, although it seems that they were estranged well before that. But she is able to obtain a legal separation in 1777. Divorce is not legalized in France until 1792. That's a long time, 1777 to 1792. So she couldn't have remarried in that time. Also, France is a Catholic country, so it takes the revolution to allow divorce to become legal. So she's able to secure a divorce, but she still doesn't remarry. She doesn't marry until 1800, another 8 years later. So my book explores, why would this be? If she's constantly linked with Vincent, her lifetime friend, why would they wait those extra 8 years to marry? She marries finally when she is clearly sick and probably dying. I will say that the woman over her shoulder, Marie Gabrielle Capet, who is also in this, hold on, I don't remember where things are, sorry. Yep, nope, that's not it. Oh, goodness. Marie Gabrielle Capet here, one of her students, lived with her for 30 years. And it's, I think, very likely that they were lovers, that they were a couple, and that she marries Vincent at the end of her life because that's the only way that Capet can inherit uh, anything from Adelaide. Otherwise, she'd sort of be out of luck. And Adelaide had no descendants, had no other family. Um, Vincent himself is in his late 50s after a lifetime of being single. I would guess that they were probably both queer, and this was a kind of family that they had created together of art.
Barbara asked, were young women more desirable if they were accomplished?
Yes. And I think that's true throughout the 18th and 19th century. that there's a, but it's so tricky, right? It's kind of like that speech in Barbie that America Ferrera gets, like they should be accomplished but not professional. They should be really good at it, but not so good that they take it too seriously. They should be delightful but not get obsessed with it. So it's this tricky thing. It's the same with music, and you see it play out over and over again in the 18th and 19th century with young women who want to pursue that calling for art, music, whatever it is, mathematics, science, and are unable to. Sometimes they are, but quite often not.
And I think our last question for tonight is, Catherine said, is there a complete book of her paintings? I know you've done a lot of research. Have you come across any book that you have?
Yes. Oh yeah, there's two books that are very complete. And I'm trying to think if there's anything that's been newly attributed since this, but this book is from the Getty Museum, Artist in the Age of Revolution by Laura Oricchio. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's really complete. It's a more academic study of her work and life. Mine is a more general biography and storytelling. But Oricchio uses this book. This didn't exist when I was a young person. I think it's from 2008. But this book, which is only in French, is from the early 70s by Anne-Marie Passet. And it was the first catalogue raisonné. So it is mostly complete, amazing reproductions, like, you know, the old big color pages. But Oricchio updates it and clarifies some of the attributions. I mean, you'll often see, I wouldn't trust anything you see online. I see incorrect attributions online all the time. And some of those come from Passet, which was really the first book to look at her entire oeuvre. That was in, like I said, the early 70s. So that's a long time after her death, but also not so recent. So Oricchio's definitely updates that.
Well, it's funny because I had a little bit of time when I was working at the desk this afternoon. I walked over to our art history section just to see if she was even mentioned in some of our art history books. And I have them behind me here. I don't know if you can see, but we've got like 1,200-page books, comprehensive art history, and she's not listed in any of them, unfortunately.
Yeah,
And
that's very usual.
yeah, it's unfortunate, but thank you for the work that you've done in bringing some of these women artists to the forefront for women of this generation to learn about her and, of course, give credit where it's due.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And everyone, if you would like to purchase a copy, again, we have a link in the chat of Portrait of a Woman. You can get your copy tonight from the Learned Owl Bookshop. And Bridget Quinn, thank you so much. We appreciated your time today. And of course, we look forward to reading your book.
Thank you so much. And if anyone has further questions or wants to contact me, you can find me on my website, bridgetquinnauthor.com.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.